Welcome to Sikhcast, brought to you by Sikh Research Institute, illuminating every path.
Why are we doing Khalsa? Why are we doing Muppet? We're gathered here today for the opening of Sikh Heritage Month, but also the launch of the exhibition 1984, How the Warrior Sings. This is an exhibit that was curated by a local and internationally renowned artist, Ruby Ward. The gallery space and the museum is free for attendance for the month of April for Sikh Heritage Month, and that's thanks to a generous donation from the Sikh Foundation in Canada. The City of Brandon is also a sponsor and supporter of this exhibit at Sikh Heritage Month, and the entire exhibition outside was produced by the Poetic Justice Foundation. So today's talk is going to be an exploration of the Sikh Genocide. And joining me today are Harinder Singh, who's the Senior Fellow, Research and Policy at Sikh Research Institute, as well as Sukhman Singh, who is co-founder and director at human rights organization Ensaaf.
Thank you, Mo. And good afternoon, and Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. A little bit about, actually, I've known Sukhman for a long time. This is the first time we're actually having a public conversation. And I think we probably wouldn't know what the boundaries are, but we'll see, because our conversations, we don't work with the public boundaries. A lot of them are in private or in, but just to put it in perspective, last conversation in the last session was about Sikh narratives. This conversation is going to be about human rights, law, and advocacy. So we're going to stay in that sphere. And the reason is, and this will be my opening question for you, Sukhman, in the Sikh world, there's a lot of confusion about, or we use certain terms very freely. I'm sure you have seen this, but I've seen it in the last 30 years at least, that people use the term Kristallnacht, people use the term it was like a Holocaust, 1984 is genocide, people throw in terms like crimes against humanity, and many other, right? Because we're, as commoners or people who are trying to give some narrative, they're struggling with it. Now, in your understanding of, from a human rights law and those who want to do advocacy on that behalf, what are these terms and which terms can we really use in June's context, in November's context of 84, in the context of the decade-long of human rights violations and extrajudicial killings? I think if we can just talk about some of the terms and why they are so important before we have a more deeper conversation.
Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this conversation and organizing this incredible exhibit. The question you asked is actually a very foundational question for Ensaaf. Gore and I, when we started the organization, one of the most fundamental questions we wanted to answer was, how can we define the nature of the crimes that we all knew had been perpetrated by the Indian state in Punjab and beyond Punjab's borders? Growing up, we had heard terms like genocide. We had heard figures ranging from 1 million to 300,000. And of course, if you read government accounts and official government white papers, they say several hundred people were killed by a few bad actors, rogue police officials, rogue security officials. So this cloud of mystery around what the nature of the crimes were, who the perpetrators had persisted for decades. We grew up with it, and we saw, even as we went through law school, and soon after graduating law school, we're putting together the framework for the organization of Ensaaf, that these same questions decades later had still not been addressed and unpacked. The reason why we look at these atrocities through the lens of international human rights law, international public law, is because it provides a framework and vocabulary that certainly by no means can address the totality and the scope of the abuses. However, it does introduce a discipline and rigor and lens through which you can investigate and begin analyzing the scale and scope of the abuses. From our perspective, we committed to looking at essentially the decades of the 1980s and 1990s. Abuses in Punjab and India targeting Sikhs certainly precede and antecede that. However, in the context of the politics of self-determination, the majority of the abuses that we know to have taken place took place in the 80s and 90s. And so that was our reference point. And when we looked at this period, we observed 3 phases or rollout of the persecution, of the targeting of Sikhs. So you could say it began with June 1984. November was a continuity, yet there was a change in the dynamic of that abuse. And then you had the ensuing, what we refer to as the decade of disappearances, which did go beyond a decade. So when we talk about June 84, we use terms like assault and massacre and attack, etc. However, in retrospect, I believe that we ought to be able to apply the law of armed conflict, known as, or codified rather in the Geneva Conventions, known as international humanitarian law, and we speak about also war crimes. In order to characterize something as a war crime, the conflict has to arise to an armed conflict. And often you don't recognize that until you look at things in retrospect. So June 84, the Indian Army's assault on Harinder Singh complex, at that time, perhaps it was difficult to analyze things through that lens. However, in retrospect, following a decade of insurgency and counterinsurgency, I think it's clear that we can establish that June was a flashpoint, but also the beginning point of an armed conflict. Another area of law that comes in relating to the analysis of war crimes is, what is the nature of the conflict? Was it an internal armed conflict? Was it an international armed conflict? Was it a mixed armed conflict? These characterizations are important because it affects what legal regimes are applied, which elements of the Geneva Conventions are applied. And again, I think now through doing research in retrospect, we can easily say that June was the beginning of certainly an internal armed conflict, but also arguably a mixed armed conflict. Why do we say that? Because without a doubt, militants were taking shelter in Pakistan. They were bringing in arms from Pakistan to engage in insurgency activities in Punjab, India. And that activity changes both the character of the conflict, but it also changes the laws that apply. Going beyond June itself and moving into November, we saw a different dynamic of abuse. We didn't see state security forces, the military, paramilitary, police forces operate the same way we saw them operate during the month of June. What we saw was the political party in power at that time, the Congress Party, marshal numerous state and central government resources and apparatus, including the railway service, including the police service, including the Central Reserve Police, including their political party workers. And so you had a hybridization of the use of violence where they were using political party apparatus as well as state apparatus to perpetrate genocide. Why do we call it genocide? Ensaaf, I believe, was the first organization to analyze the violence in Delhi through the lens of the law of genocide, specifically the Genocide Convention. Working with allies, we were able to secure papers that had previously never been made public, that were the record that was created by the Mishra Commission. So the Mishra Commission was one of many commissions that was convened to look into the genocidal violence of November '84. We were able to secure the court record, including thousands of affidavits. And looking at that factual record from eyewitness testimony and applying the law of genocide, we were able to establish that what unfolded in Delhi in November '84 arises to genocide. And what's so difficult to prove or establish with genocide is the intent. How do we know that the attackers intended to target and kill and persecute Sikhs as an identifiable group of Sikhs? This is one of the hardest elements to prove, which is why there have been globally such few convictions under the Genocide Convention, or for the crime of genocide, rather, I should say. However, upon looking at the witness statements that were recorded, we were able to establish that, in fact, the violence was perpetrated with this genocidal attempt. Now, moving beyond November and looking at the ensuing decade of disappearances, we saw a further evolution of the atrocities. What we saw was the state implement a legal regime that empowered and emboldened security forces to engage in illegal and warrantless searches, illegal and indefinite detention, and the ability to kill with impunity. These legal frameworks set the stage for widespread and systematic torture, extrajudicial killings, and enforced disappearances. How do we know that these abuses were in fact widespread and systematic? Through our work, we were able to document well over 5,000 of these incidences throughout Punjab. These are the ones that we're able to publicly share. And the question that we struggled with when looking at the research and doing the documentation and engaging in the investigations was the same one that we had been posed with as a community since 1984. How do we define these crimes? How do we establish a record of these crimes? And through our work and through observing where the abuses unfolded, the timescale through which they unfolded, and who the perpetrators of these abuses were, we were able to establish both the widespread and systematic nature. And I use these terms intentionally because they are specific terms that are elements for the international crime of crimes against humanity. So in crimes against humanity, you're establishing that the abuses are either widespread or systematic. And we recognize that the only way to prove that the atrocities that Sikhs had suffered was through a comprehensive and thorough process of documentation. And upon concluding that process, we can say that the abuses that unfolded well over a decade easily meet that standard. And now, well over several decades, 4 decades since the events of June '84, when we look back at these decades, I believe we can now define all the phases and elements of these crimes, ranging from war crimes or violations of the Geneva Conventions, to genocide, to crimes against humanity. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Sukhman. This was important for us to understand because in our community, sometimes we don't understand these differentiations and we like to throw the terms around. I want to build on a couple of things we talked about and maybe have a conversation explicitly about 1 or 2 cases. One of the things which you have mentioned is, and this may be a surprise to most of you, that if we don't tell the full narrative of June 84, we cannot apply those Geneva Conventions on war crimes. Because it is a war when you're fighting back. This is why it's important to tell the full narrative. Because when we say they tied their hands behind the back with their own turbans and shot them at the point blank range at the Amritsar railway station as well as at Parakrama, that's the convention which will apply them, because you're not allowed to do that with prisoners of war. So similarly, widespread and systematic, as you mentioned, for both crimes against humanity and genocide, which applies to November 84, as well as the decade of impunity. So it's been 40 years. Ensaaf has been operational for 20 plus years. In these 40 years, in the legal arena, because that's where the battle is in your case and what you work in the human rights law angle, what has been accomplished? You and I talk about some of this, but let's share with the audience some of the things which have already been accomplished.
I would say the moment that these abuses began to be perpetrated, victims and communities made serious excuse me. They made serious attempts to pursue the disappearance of their loved ones and attempts at legal justice. However, the climate at that time was such that it was virtually impossible to persist in legal advocacy and seek remedial measures and justice through the courts. Despite these conditions, there were serious human rights initiatives, most notably that you might all be familiar, that were organized by groups like the Committee on Coordination on Enforced Disappearances in Punjab, and then of course the work of Shahid Jaswant Singh Kalra, who investigated and documented disappearances ending in secret mass cremations. So a substantial record had been created beginning in the 80s and 90s, establishing that security forces had tortured and disappeared and killed Sikhs. These initiatives led to significant legal cases. Of course, you have the individual disappearance and murder case of Jaswant Singh Kalra, and you have the mass cremations case. The reason why these cases I think are important to highlight is because of the precedent that they set. So for the first time, you have the Supreme Court of India recognizing that the state had committed a flagrant violation of human rights on a mass scale. And that's a direct quote from a Supreme Court decision. Additionally, because Jaswant Singh Kalra was so well loved and his findings were so explosive, that he was in effect the last enforced disappearance that was perpetrated in Punjab as part of that context and climate of targeting those that were part of the politics of self-determination. The mass cremations case is also very critical because you have the first time that the state, there's numerous defects with that investigation, and it certainly was a whitewashing to a large extent. However, during that process, you have for the first time records of secret cremations being submitted to the Supreme Court and India's National Human Rights Commission, establishing an irrefutable evidence of the state's involvement in disappearances and secret cremations. You also have for the first time victim families being compensated for the secret and unlawful cremation of their loved ones. In addition, there were numerous lawyers who were litigating individual cases of enforced disappearances and unlawful killings. One case, if I may highlight in particular, and this individual's profile is featured in the exhibit, is an attorney and human rights defender, Sukhman Singh. And this May is actually the 30th anniversary of his enforced disappearance. His work was so remarkable because of the number of lives he saved. What he observed was that people in police custody were unlikely to survive. So after the police would abduct somebody and detain them in their police stations, the chances of their survival were very low. Often they were tortured to death or they were disappeared. And given that he was a lawyer and a criminal defense lawyer, he understood how to use the procedure to get these individuals that were in police custody removed from the local police stations and into judicial custody, what we would call jail. So in India, through the process of police remand, individuals are detained at police stations. However, through Sukhman Singh Patti's petitions, he would get these individuals' detentions acknowledged, and once the detention is acknowledged, they have to be processed within a certain period of time and then thereby transferred to judicial custody, which fall under the courts. And through that process, he was able to save the lives of hundreds of officials because they were now individuals, because they were no longer in the custody of the police, and now technically they fall under the auspices of the judiciary. Because he was foiling the plans of Punjab police to kill these individuals, he posed an obstacle to them. And so what they did is they abducted and disappeared him. And so this is one example of many examples of people who are doing incredible work from the moment that these atrocities happened.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Sukhman. As you were talking about, he mentioned the Mishra Commission documents and affidavits. So when Ensaaf was the first organization to do a legal analysis of what had happened in Delhi in November 1984, and that was put out at the 20th anniversary. The book was called 20 Years of Impunity. And after that analysis, and in last 10 years now, which means 10 years after that, the circumstances in Delhi, for example, because of the political climate in India, because of that book, because of persistency of Mr. Fulka, in last 10 years, there have been 2 judgments in Delhi High Court, where they actually wrote this in a judgment. In the term genocide and the term crimes against humanity, we haven't been able to use in India because the international law was not being allowed to be implemented or interpreted in India. And in order to get to that judgment, it took an international effort, not just from here, but also from UK and international human rights lawyers. So there are some legal cases which were won in Delhi. There are many legal cases where some of these things got established as well. And I want to just bring in maybe another Punjab angle. In fact, let's talk about last week. Let's make it very real. Last week is the first time, and Sukhman, give us details on that, and I'm just going to mention the case. This is very big in Punjab court system right now, that there is an acknowledgement of mass killings, multiple cases at the same time, last week because of the efforts of one of the current human rights lawyer, Mr. Virka. Do you want to give some details on that, that justice is slow, many people die pursuing it, but the climate has at least acknowledging some of this. This just happened in the last 2 weeks. Go ahead.
So before I unpack that specific case, I want to kind of go back to the mass cremations case that I referred to because it relates to this recent conviction. So when that mass cremations case came before the Supreme Court divided responsibility for that case among 2 entities, the National Human Rights Commission and India's Central Bureau of Investigation. The Central Bureau of Investigation was tasked with, mandated with looking into criminal culpability. Who were the perpetrators of these secret cremations? How did they become bodies in the first place in order that they were then ultimately cremated. The National Human Rights Commission looked at all other issues, such as compensation. That process had numerous flaws, and as I alluded earlier, it in a way served to whitewash the nature of the crime, because they were able to escape the process of building a record by saying that that was the CBI's job. We're simply going to look at whether or not the families deserve compensation because they weren't invited to the cremation ceremony. The CBI, for decades, did not move forward with their criminal investigation and prosecuting the culpable officials. However, because of work like lawyers like Sarbjit Singh Verka, who continued to put pressure on the CBI and filed complaints against their failure to investigate and prosecute, those cases have started to be investigated and prosecuted. And so we've had a spate of convictions over the last several years of low-level officials. And so the case that Harinder is referring to led to concerned the abduction, disappearance, and extrajudicial killing of Harinder Singh from village Jabal in Tarantar. He was abducted by a large police force. At that time, it was, I believe, DSP Ashok Kumar, Ajit Singh Sandhu, who was also the notorious SSP who had disappeared, tortured, and killed Sukhman Singh Kalra, and also responsible for numerous other atrocities, and SHO Ajit Singh. So in the recent conviction, because both Ashok Kumar and Ajit Singh Sandhu are now deceased, they escaped accountability in that sense. However, Ajit Singh was convicted for 10 years. That certainly is a victory. However, that case also exposes one of the fundamental flaws of India's legal standards and its legal code. Ajit Singh was sentenced to 10 years under Section, I believe, 136 of the Indian Penal Code, which is abduction with intent to murder. He was not convicted for the murder itself. What's problematic with this is because he was only charged with the abduction, and India only acknowledges the crime of abduction, there's been no accountability for the crimes of enforced disappearance. There's a big distinction between abduction and enforced disappearance. International law regards enforced disappearances as the more serious crime than an unlawful killing or murder or extrajudicial execution. Why? Because of the heinous and ongoing impact that an enforced disappearance has, both on the victim and under the assumption that they may be alive someplace, but moreover, because of the impact on surviving family members. So not only is the victim's right to life being violated, the surviving family members' right to truth and justice is also being violated. They're in a perpetual state of not knowing. However, under India's law, they characterize enforced disappearances as kidnapping or abductions, and they are met with a much lower sentence, even though they are in fact a much more serious crime.
Thank you for sharing that distinction as well. While there are some small wins, the larger issues remain basically inaccessible right now. You know, I want to shift the focus a little bit into the efforts part. Before the Mishra Commission files was one of them, which were somebody needs to collect the data. Then somebody needs to analyze it. And then hope for there is a circumstance in the courts where some of that analysis can be allowed by a judge who is sitting on the bench. So many things have to fall in place, but at the background of it is the evidence, the data. And actually, when you were mentioning that, Sukhman, I remember being there. I lived in Punjab between 97 and 2002. And I do want to share something here. Don't say people of Punjab are afraid. They are not. I saw before even CCDP, which is Coordination Committee for Disappearances in Punjab, there was a People's Commission set up there under Justice Tiwana. I went to that meeting. The hotel cancelled it, the Gurdwara, Chauthi sector Gurdwara allowed that. After that, the government did not allow any other gatherings. And not hundreds, thousands of people showed up from Punjab to register a loved one who had been disappeared by the state. So there were these efforts done. This is all happening between 97 and 99 in Punjab, in Chandigarh and Mohali. And then when that was stopped, and this is where a retired Justice Tiwana is heading it. This is like people who understand the legal frameworks and the manipulations in India as well. Then comes committees like Coordination Committee for Disappearances in Punjab, who, in fact, incidentally, I was just in India, and one of the individuals, Harinder, who worked with them in the early days, and I ran into him 2 months ago, actually a month ago, and I'm like, how are you, man? I just want to share the people's part. And he's like, bas pucho na kuch. People think that, collect karan da ki faida hoya, koi pursue nahi kar raha diligently. It's not koi, but he feels much more needs to be done, right? So there are things like that. So people did work on these things. The data was collected. In fact, I want to bring in a little bit of an Ensaaf story and your story here. I ran into Jaskaran because of these misrecognition files. I remember a young Harvard graduate who I meet in Chandigarh because I was staying there those days. And that was Jaskaran. And she was there on a fellowship to work with CCDP. Ramnaran Kumar, Gurtej Singh, Harinder, and many other people. And back then, I remember the Indian Supreme Court lawyer, Nitya and Ashok, were also part of these efforts. So there were Sikhs and non-Sikhs, people who understand Sikh ideas, lawyers, non-lawyers. Many people were involved in these activities. At the same time, then Sukhman I ran into much later. He comes from a background of doing law at American and from CJA. I want you guys to know this. When he's speaking, you can tell there's a lot of nuancing to understand these things, right? You need a lot of patience. You need a lot of data and analysis. CJA is Center for Justice and Accountability. They pursue these kind of perpetrators on American soil. That's where he was doing his internship. So you got somebody who was in the field in Punjab, you got somebody who was doing this in America, and two of them come together. Tell us how you guys came together to do work on impunity in Punjab with those two backgrounds.
Jaskaran and I were fortunate enough to collaborate on a conference at Harvard when we were both law students. And we brought together human rights defenders who are working on atrocity crimes in India and Kashmir. So there were Kurum Pervez, who's actually a very well-known human rights defender who's been detained now for several years by India, was there. We had individuals from representing the northeastern states who experienced similar atrocities as Punjab. Numerous self-determination movements, whether it's Nagaland or Mizoram or Assam. There were individuals from Gujarat, and at that time Gujarat had just emerged from the pogroms orchestrated against the Muslim community there. And it was through those conversations that we developed an understanding of what does it take to address issues of impunity for gross human rights violations. And something that was very evident was that without establishing a thorough foundation of documented human rights abuses, it's very difficult to then engage in legal advocacy or international advocacy or report writing, because ultimately people want factual information, they want documented information, and they often want that information from primary sources, which is either witnesses or victims or survivors of these abuses. And so from our experiences, from that conference, and then, we went on to kind of work through our respective fellowships, we maintain that understanding that if we want to move the meter on these issues of impunity and justice for gross human rights violations, it'll be critical to build upon the work that had happened in Punjab but had been stalled. And those insights planted the idea that we have to make an effort to investigate and document every single enforced disappearance and unlawful killing in Punjab. And so fast forward in 2009, and so now we're a few years into Ensaaf, Ensaaf's founding, we launched an initiative to visit each of Punjab's 13,000 villages and urban areas to find out who had been disappeared and killed. That initiative unfolded over 6 years. And through that documentation and archival research, we've cataloged 20,000 violent deaths and disappearances, and over 5,000 of those, I think we can definitively say, were perpetrated by India's security forces.
So that sounds like what he just said in 3 minutes. Let me give you a couple of inklings of that work that I'm familiar with. Just to put out the first team to India to do this, you can imagine कि कभी कितना ही नहीं है कि करेंगे. Like, who's going to go there? What's the performer going to look like? Who's going to take care of the security of those people? What if police says something? What if CBI shows up and interrogates our IB? It's a lot of things you have to plan for. I remember in those days when we had some discussion, like we're looking for some doctors even. Like, how are we going to know what to even create a performer for based on the previous performers? And I remember calling my own brother, you know, you gotta go. I remember he went on the first two. So the point is convincing people, planning for it, taking care of the securities, and then developing the team. I would actually want to mention another incident because you weren't, so I'll take a little liberty to say that. You know, even the biggest case in Punjab we have won symbolically, legally. He mentioned the name Ajit Singh Sandhu, that SSP of Tarantaran, who KPS Gill was protecting. He went all the way to Indian Parliament for that protection when that case was going on. After his suicide, so-called suicide, we don't know what really happened. Mr. Kara's conviction, it was eventually the testimony of 2 of the 6 people who agreed that they did it. What does it take to convince those people? What does it take to get their diaries to be used? It's a lot of work is what I'm trying to say. You know, so jada document karna, to pursue the cases, finding the right appearance lawyers like, you know, just the lawyer Bans, who is Rajvinder. But you know, the back end work is happening here with these guys. And then going there, selectively giving advice, because you cannot appear in certain courts, the Indian lawyers have to appear. It is incredible amount of work. And in some cases, you hear a success. In most cases, you don't see these. So I want you guys to know that there is incredible effort which goes on to just gather the data, and it continues, and now to analyze and then present it in a meaningful way. And by the way, even CBI, I can share this with you. When these 2 convictions happened in Delhi, 2 of the CBI lawyers, one of them was a Sikh guy. I do want you guys to know this as well. They actually acknowledged how good the work was. So there's Ensaaf's work, there are other works going on, that legally, there was acknowledgement by 2 of the CBI lawyers, one happens to be Sikhs, that this is some serious analysis. You know, so bande har thaan baithe, that you're looking for the right opportunity at the right time, at the right bench, in the right political climate, but all of that requires preparation, which is what you're hearing in the Punjab's cases from Sukhman. So if I move a little bit on that a little bit more, maybe you should share another personal story if you're open to that. And maybe you can personalize. I know you don't like doing this, so you know, this, I'll relate it to what Mo was asking me earlier, and we are at exhibition, and Ensaaf is a partner. You helped them put this exhibition together. There are a lot of challenges. There's a legal one, so I'm coming out of the legal a little bit. There are a lot of challenges in preserving this part of the narrative as well, right? And in these, how are you dealing with those challenges? So one is what you end up presenting in the West to the community and the non-community members. The other is when you are traveling in Punjab, because you got to look at which part of this memory or experience do I preserve for public memory.
Thank you. As you could imagine, the majority of the evidence of these atrocities actually lies with the perpetrators. You could call it the banality of evil or administrations. They keep records of everything. We know through our work that the police officers who ultimately were executing their victims were also often photographing the evidence of the execution, because that is how they established that they followed through the orders that they were given. That is how they were able to claim their cash rewards for producing the bodies. And we've found post-mortem reports, photographs. There's also things known as the daily diaries that the lower level police officers often kept to establish that they were complying with orders, but also to cover their bases. So in the event that they were ever accused of these crimes, they would have a record themselves to show that we were ordered to abduct this person or interrogate and torture and kill this person. That being said, you have virtually no access to this information. The state has no interest in making these records available. The majority of these records have likely been destroyed. And so what you're left with is the memory of witnesses and the memory of victims. And so one of our core focuses has been to capture as much as possible in the voices and the words of the people who suffered through these abuses. And so one of our kind of core initiatives now is to prepare video testimonials. So we've presented over 5,000 cases in an interactive data visualization site. However, they don't illustrate the scope of these abuses. And so for that, we wanted to interview on video families whose cases are particularly compelling and particularly complex, because I think it's critical to preserve that oral history and that memory, given the reality of how difficult it is to collect official records that speak to those same crimes and abuses.
I understand your reservation, I guess. No worries. We'll continue. Look.
No, please feel free to redirect. I lost my track of thought.
We discussed many things, not in publicly, so I'm not going to push too much. But, I kind of alluded to it, even in Mr. Kalada's case, right? That we got to be careful not to put down blanketly any administrative and police and other officials. Eventually, they are stepping up to get some of the convictions as well. I can tell you, I'm in conversations with one former DGP for the last 10 years. And we were talking about this yesterday. We haven't had any senior person convicted in Punjab. The most senior in Delhi we got was Sajjan Kumar, because he was a done deal politically for Congress. That's the reality. Jagdish Tytler is not a done deal, but political climate somehow opened the CBI investigation again. If there was really a consciousness of Congress of Gandhi, they would have said, we will not let Kamal Nath fight on our ticket. That could be a serious reconciliation. But that's not happening anywhere. So, and by the way, when Sukhman was talking about, He's not touching much on November 84 because Ensaaf's work is in Punjab, but he referenced that in the analysis they had done. Ved Marwa, who was the police commissioner of Delhi, he's on the record, video record saying, we are trained to contain any riot within 2 to 4 hours in now what they call an NCR, which is the Delhi area, state of Delhi. He says we were ordered not to do anything. So this is not just complicit net of the state. We use these vocabularies. It's very important to understand that this is actually state doing it itself. State is orchestrating it, implementing it, planning it with its own machineries. So what I wanted to get into a little bit was towards, I think we have 8 minutes.
Can I respond to
Sure.
something that I think is important when we are speaking about justice? So we referenced the Geneva Conventions. We've defined these various crimes as war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide. I think it's important to, also recognize the limitations of these frameworks or standards. The biggest one being that this is criminal law. So in criminal law, you are trying to punish individuals. And so the standard to convict someone of genocide is very, very high. Secondarily, you're impugning an individual. Everybody recognizes that the crime of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes cannot happen or only happen largely when the state participates or facilitates these types of atrocities. However, the state is not on trial. We're trying to put on trial individual actors. And so it doesn't address the issues of the state's involvement, complicity actions, and it furthermore does not address society's complicity and silence in creating climates that allow these types of atrocities to unfold. So legal justice is certainly important. Criminal prosecutions are certainly important. However, it's unlikely that those measures in and of themselves will prevent these abuses from recurring. There will always be new perpetrators who are willing to do the state's bidding. What's critical is to advocate for measures that will reform the state and society to ensure and guarantee that atrocities cannot recur.
Yeah, so we are navigating here. Part of the conversation is about there's international law, dynamics in Punjab, the national politics of India, and dynamics in Delhi. So there's a lot of these things you have to keep in mind as to what's going on. And what I was trying to say earlier, that's why was, if you don't have an evidence, you need a testimony, right? Because so when the former DGP thing I was trying to share with you was, because I know IG in Punjab, former IG, I know former DGP, who have clearly said to me, and many people who are activists know this, that O.P. Sharma used to come to Punjab and he used to tell everyone above SSSP level that this is the quota for killing for this month. You're not going to get this in writing in chain of command. These two people are still not willing to come out publicly and give their testimony, and he keeps telling me, Harinder, you don't understand us. Sanu inhone maar chhadna, sare parivar ko maar chhadna. Even the former DGP is saying this. So unless there is a testimony of some kind, you can't get senior people to get convictions. There have been trials. I won't get into it, but there was false rumors also start in America like this as well, where a list was made who to pursue in America because SSPs were visiting here. And in the media, it became several years ago that this is a hit list. It was not a hit list. It was who can you pursue in America as a perpetrator as well. So a lot of these efforts in the UK and US, some plannings that happened, but the execution couldn't work out. I think we are at the end of the time where I want to take it towards the end is, I actually want to mention one more thing. Sure. Because we have brought up Mr. Khalida so many times, part of my reason to get involved, and then eventually I run into the right lawyers and the people who know how to do these things. Between 91 and 95, 93 is when Mr. Cholera, I used to get, sorry?
95 was his abduction.
So by the time 95 comes, so 93, I was sharing that between 91 and 93, I got to know about their work. When they were part of Shromani Akali Dal Human Rights Wing. Between 93 and 95, I used to get a weekly 5 to 7 page report from them. In Kansas days, I was just a young graduate working, and part of my work used to be taking that report and disseminating it. And all this conversation about UN chila jo ye kar de, aajkal bhi bada rauda penda na. I want to talk about that rauda a little bit. Nothing was possible even in those days. It takes, so him and I talk about sometime, hey man, I have 6 hours in Geneva. Should we try to figure out when can UNCHR really take on a case of this nature? And he's like, we are not ready. I'm sharing this with you. Don't go by a lot of the hype and the rhetoric in the community. Lawyers have to figure this out. They have to create the right cases if you want to really take care of things and some international conventions. So Sukhman, if you can, in a somewhat explicit way or maybe generic, it's up to you. What else can be pursued at this point in the current climate, the political climate, the level of documentations what we have? What can be pursued for the next 10 years?
From our observations of what we've seen in India and Punjab, I think a lot more can be done through more thorough lawyering. Right now, there's only a handful of lawyers who are shouldering a huge amount of the burden and often unsupported. And even outside of the Punjab context, whether I'm speaking to Supreme Court lawyers there or High Court lawyers there, the quality of the work and lawyering needs to be elevated. But often lawyers are, they have their breadwinning practice and then they have their pro bono practice, which often suffers and languishes because they can't allocate the same time and resources to litigating human rights matters. So I think there's still huge potential to pursue very important human rights cases in India if we're able to find a way to support the lawyers to dedicate and devote themselves to these cases the same way they do to their paying cases. Internationally, globally, I think there's also some initiatives that could happen, but I don't want to speak prematurely, and
so guys, thank you, Sukhman, for sharing this.
So just sorry, one last point, and this kind of speaks to something you mentioned earlier. We also have to keep in mind that the Indian state is not a monolithic entity. There's numerous agencies, branches of governments. There are many people who want to do the right thing, who are capable of doing the right thing. Of course, there's the political realities, there's the corruption, there's the vindictiveness, there's the biases, et cetera, et cetera. However, every judge is not bad, every prosecutor is not bad, every government lawyer is not bad, et cetera. I think more effort must be made and can be made, and that in and of itself will yield a dividend.
And thank you for sharing that. This is about really building the right relationships and alliances. It's a lot of hard work. Serious people only want to work with serious people. People who make a lot of noise, nobody wants to work with also. I'm sharing this because he's not going to say this. They've been at it for 20 years. It's going to be more work. Human rights work, impunity hasn't ended. So guess what? This work is not going to end. Look, I am of the belief, when I get asked this question, there are only 2 things needed if you really are serious about it. A solid team of lawyers, double down, triple down, 5x on it. Globally, we know that's what works. We don't have enough competent lawyers working on this. If we had a team of 20 people, 50 people working on this diligently with a reasonable budget, with the right allies who are constitutional experts, appearance lawyers, litigation lawyers in India, you will see many more things. And then the education and awareness is archiving, not archiving for the evidence they need, but to educate people becomes much more meaningful. But unless you win legal battles, we don't have Searchlight organization right now who's going to go pursue that, as many people like to talk about how they still hunt the Nazi Germany officers and SS officers. But the ones we know, we are not even able to pursue those. So all those romances need to be brought into at least legally. Supporting, there are only 2 or 3 organizations who are really doing it. Ensaaf is the US-based one. Supporting the lawyers so they can more diligently work with it and bring the more right lawyers and the right partners, the right legal activists to write their reports, the forwards to it, where the right conditions, India may have to listen to it and allow certain things. Thank you. Hopefully you got many more things out of it. If you have more questions, Sukhman is around all day. Please do talk to him. Do support Ensaaf. If there is one organization I say support for this work, the serious documentation to pursue impunity in India. That's their work. It's very clear work. And the name is Ensaaf, which means justice. And in Gurbani, the creator we believe in is actually the one who delivers justice through us. So this is another form of delivering justice through legal work. Thank you. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
You are listening to Sikhcast by Sikh Research Institute, illuminating every path.